Well, of course, we all know what happens to rude people.
We do indeed.
Yeah,
They
get served.
They get served. They do. They get turned into something beautiful.
Absolutely.
You've been terribly rude, Miss Lowndes.
Oh dear. It's when he says later as well, oh, Miss Lowndes, you are naughty. Flirty Hannibal is great.
Oh yeah.
He's always having a good time, isn't he? It doesn't matter what, even if people are being terribly rude, which he doesn't like, he's always having fun. He's always playing his little games.
In fact, when I watched these 2 episodes, because as I said in our introductory episode, I've only ever seen the series through beginning to end once. This is my second go, so it's episodes 1 and 2 for me. It's the second time ever, but it seemed to be a bit of a Mads-themed weekend because we decided to rewatch Casino Royale, which I haven't seen pretty much since it came out, and I was quite taken aback just by how everything, because I think Mads Mikkelsen sometimes gets the charge of being kind of the same in everything, and he really isn't. His whole physicality and the way he used his voice, everything as Le Chiffre was so different. And because I'd seen it right off the back of watching him as Hannibal, it's like, there you go. Okay, he's not showy, but that's a different character.
Yeah, absolutely. And he appears in a couple of the Marvel films as well, doesn't he, as villainous characters who are very, very different from most of the other characters that he plays.
Sweet.
Yeah, he's a wizard, I believe, in Doctor Strange, like an evil wizard or something to that effect.
Right. I dropped off a long time ago. I think I know I've got that very odd situation as well with the only one I ever really liked, and I only saw the first few, is the one everyone hated. And I quite like Hulk.
Oh, which one? Ang Lee's Hulk?
I never saw Ang Lee's Hulk. So the one with Norton started it, where it starts in Brazil.
Yeah,
I rather like that one. Yeah.
Me too.
There you go. That's as
I
far
must
as
admit, I like the Ang Lee one. I know that everyone hates it. They absolutely hate its guts. But I like all that allusion to Greek myth and stuff that's going on in it. And I know the CG is terrible. But apparently that was bizarrely deliberate. Ang Lee wanted it to look like a comic book character come to life.
All right.
Apparently,
it's weird. For such a well-known director, I think I've only ever seen one Ang Lee movie, and it was it's called The Ice Storm, from many years ago. Yeah, just a sort of family conflict drama. I can't even remember much about it, but that's the film. I think that's the only Ang Lee film I've ever seen.
Good movie.
Yeah, I have to check it out again.
Ricci.
Oh well, there you go.
Christina Ricci's in it. Oh yeah, absolutely sold.
So how do you know what I say about Ang Lee? Don't make him Ang Lee because you wouldn't like him. I mean, he's Ang Lee.
All his clothes fall off and he's left with a pair of natty shorts. And it's because Hulk always skipped leg day. Else he would have been through the trousers as well, wouldn't he?
Oh my god, this is supposed to be a Hannibal podcast. How did this happen?
Well, how is this happening?
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, I know it's one of our podcasts and we do have this tendency, but even so, this is really off-piste.
Just what happened.
Is there a format or a?
No, not really. No.
Oh, okay.
I was also listening to your the Jaws podcast about halfway through. That's great fun. Great fun.
That was a good chat.
It was one of those.
That was good fun to record.
Yeah, it's one of those where I was listening to it and I was thinking, well, why haven't we done this before? How has Jaws not come up before? I mean, I was actually talking to Kit about this, and it didn't come up in like his My Life in Horror series either.
It was really random. He just tweeted how he was settling down to watch it with his daughter, and it was her very first time of seeing it. And I just went, I sort of tweeted to him, and that's a really great idea. I've not seen that film in about 20 years. So then I sat down, watched it, and then before long it was like, why have we not sort of got our heads together and done something about this? Because it seems obvious, but so
it does,
obvious,
doesn't it? I'm really shocked. I'm really surprised that it hasn't come up in at least one of the podcasts thus far, because my experience of it, like Kit's, is that it's completely ambient. It's always been there. It's an artifact of childhood. I remember loving that film as a kid, absolutely loving it to bits, and then coming back to it as an adult and realizing that actually that love is entirely justified.
Yeah,
it's
nice
a
when that
beautiful film. It's a stunner of a film.
It's really, really well made.
Yeah.
And it's a bit strange, really, when that happens, when you go back to something you were obsessed with as a kid, and wow, this is actually good.
It's really good, and given its sort
really?
of like its summer blockbuster credentials, it's
but of course, it wasn't to know
film.
it was even going to be that because it's the first one, isn't it?
It's the first
one,
as
we understand
yeah.
it. Yeah, as we understand it. So I think it was.
It doesn't really bear much
Sorry,
relationship to what we think of as the blockbuster now, does it? Compared to blockbusters now, it looks like an art piece.
I was going to say it looks like
a chamber piece. It's like it's a piece of social realist satire about small wealthy communities and small town politics, and it's almost a chamber piece focusing on the interrelationship between three characters in its second half, and there's loads of really careful characterization, and that's not what the summer blockbuster is now.
No, well, for one thing, Jaws is actually about something, whereas summer blockbusters generally these days are not. They're not about anything. They're sort of vacuous artifacts. They're things like the Transformers films, aren't they? And these hollow nostalgia pieces.
I have never seen a single one of those, so I can't comment on the Transformers films.
Are migraines on celluloid. I literally have never. The second Transformers film I had to take a service user to see, and it is one of the only films that has literally given me a headache. It's so aggressive. It's so bombastic, and it feels like it's picking you up and shaking you and shouting at you. And I hated it. I hated it. They are some of the worst cinema experiences I've ever had. And the third Transformers film, I walked out of. It's one of the very few films in my cinema history, because I've got a fair high degree of tolerance for bad cinema. But they hurt to watch, especially if you're seeing them in the cinema. They physically hurt.
Well, I've only seen one film in the cinema since the era of COVID, and no, two. I've seen two, and I chose when I went. So there were very few people because I'm a wuss. But I have to wear earplugs in the cinema. I mean, I'm very sensitive anyway, but I had tinnitus for years, audio shock tinnitus, rather than brought on by any other means, and it took 5 years for it to go, or at least recede, or at least for me to train myself not to monitor it or go searching for it. And, but it's made me really paranoid about the decibel levels in cinemas, and I did a bit of research into them, and really there is no health and safety on this except for the staff. The staff are, they're given a certain amount of training on when they enter the auditorium to sort of clear up and do what they have to do. But there's literally nothing. You can just go as loud as you want, and so the last several years now, I haven't been for a number of years, but always have to stuff my industrial earplugs in, and I hear everything perfectly. You're so bombarded with noise, and it means it filters out quite a bit of the what is laughingly termed incidental music, and some of the stuff on the phone. I can actually focus in on the dialogue. So it's useful.
Are you sure that's a good idea, though?
Well, it depends on the kind of film you're subjecting yourself to.
Depends on the film, I'd assume.
Although I have to say that the last film I went to see in the cinema did deserve it, because for what is an absolutely ludicrous piece of popcorn cinema and totally daft, when they were doing I think most cinemas, View, I believe, were basically showing every Bond film in order once a week to coincide with the 60th anniversary.
Right.
The only one I wanted to see in the cinema was Moonraker, because by dint of I couldn't have seen it when it originally went out, but also it just always struck me as the one that probably really did work on the big screen. But I had my earplugs in. But I mean, that script sings for what is a nonsensical movie. It has the most gorgeous dialogue. You could sing it. So, the dialogue is lovely. All those little speeches that Michael Lonsdale gets, and the jokes. And you think, my God, this is a man who worked with Truffaut and Wells, and here he is, and he's getting to play what is basically the master in a James Bond film. And he gets these delightful speeches that just so, all this purple prose, it's great.
Moonraker, because I'm not terribly au fait with the Bond canon, to be perfectly honest. See, that's the one that's partially in space. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
The one that real serious Bond aficionados sort of go red-faced and embarrassed about, but
I was
very
going to say,
possibly the best one.
Yeah, this is the red-headed stepchild, isn't it?
Yeah, but if you don't have that relationship with them, I mean, I love the movies, but I don't have that sort of relationship with them. You just think, this is nuts, and this is exactly what this kind of thing should be, and this is the one that at least has the balls to do it, and just
go there, just like, who cares, right?
I mean,
it's absurd anyway at base premise, so let's just go for it.
Capitalist accelerationist wants to bring about the end of life on Earth and basically be God in the heavens, literally God in the heavens, and repopulate the planet with Benetton models. I mean, and the only man who can stop him probably has the aroma of an airport cologne.
I love it. That's such a great descriptor of the like those early Bonds. I think that's brilliant.
I always say that you can somehow smell Roger Moore. He's like one of the only leading men you can kind of smell, and it's Brute or
now I'm
something like that.
What do like leading men actors? What do they smell like? What does Al Pacino smell like?
Mads Mikkelsen in Hannibal must have the best
he must smell amazing.
He must. It's like and because of the character's sensitivity to smell, it's going to be so delicately balanced.
Yeah.
But
can you imagine, because of his diet and whatnot, because he doesn't put anything that toxic into his body, he probably smells really good. Just on a supernatural level, everything about Hannibal is kind of preternatural, isn't it? So he probably gets up smelling fine.
Yeah, it's a terrible reflection when you're watching something like Hannibal and you're watching the scenes where people are dining. And I sort of had my head in my hands at one point, and my partner said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Well, because social life has changed so much over the last few years, I realized that I actually just do eat like Homer Simpson, and I'm going to have to relearn how to eat in company.
Eat socially, yeah.
Because it's just, I mean, my God, certifiable. It's awful. The way I eat.
I'm slowly getting there. I'm slowly getting back into being able to actually inhabit like dining rooms and restaurants and whatnot, and actually hold a semi-cogent conversation while eating a burger or something.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I still have these bouts of, let's call it what it is, bouts of fear, because I know the current subvariant is particularly nasty on the ocular centers on the eyes, but because that's my vulnerability, I got the eye situation from the last one, which didn't attack the eyes in quite the same. So this one, it's all like, I think I'll just be a little bit careful with this. But I think it's just going to be, I just find it's going to be a bit of a long run up for me. But that's fine.
I find a little bit of
do what it
courage does help me, to be honest. A G&T or something that usually helps. A good long one,
Yeah.
A little bit of social lubrication doesn't hurt at all.
No, and it's odd because of that's something that I think probably, like quite a lot of people, when we were doing things like lockdowns, I noticed that my alcohol intake, it didn't so much creep up as raced up. And then to counter that, I actually went to nothing for a long time more recently, and then I had a drink on the weekend, and I was anyone's.
Well, I must admit, I mean, I'm more of a social drinker. So during the lockdown, it degraded to absolutely nothing. But since we've started moving back out into something approaching a social order, yeah, I've noticed that the intake has become a lot more when I'm in company. A lot more. I mean, like I had I am actually sort of recovering from a slew of gin-based cocktails at the moment, so which are very nice. They were very, very lovely.
Anything
but
gin-based for me is that it's always that's the one that wakes up at 4 o'clock wanting to reconsider your entire life.
Yes.
Sometimes quite drastically.
It's the one
it's a
that has
horrible
you crying
depressant
on the stairs. It has you crying upside down on the stairs, lamenting your existence.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I do all of that anyway, so
yeah, you really don't want to go near the gin.
It's amazing how what a powerful depressant it is as well. I mean, I've got to, I said this years ago. I just want to stop, because I grew up in a port town, a naval town, and so it was just, people always used to, when I started living in other places, people would find it quite funny that I would say, "Oh yeah, I'll have a gin and tonic or something." Yeah. They go, "What?" And say, "Oh right, well yeah, I grew up in Plymouth, and that was like a big thing. It's got its own gin distillery down there, and people just drink gin and tonics, and it's it carries no real connotation, But it's after a while, it's like, this stuff's not actually so great on the old brain box.
No, psychologically, it's a bad one. I find that it wires me, keeps me up for some reason. Just cannot sleep on the damn stuff. It's like having caffeine,
Yeah.
And then you get those 4 o'clock in the morning thoughts intruding at a particular point.
Yeah.
Anyway, I actually did just a moment ago rewatch both of the episodes that we're going to discuss this evening, Aperitif and Amuse, Bouche. The opening episode of Hannibal. This is a sneaky little episode of a show, isn't it? What an intro, what a pilot, where it's trying so hard to trick you into thinking that it's something it isn't.
Yeah, I always say about this, it cosplays as CSI Baltimore. That's
absolutely that. And I love the way that it doesn't make any bones about it. You're just there immediately. You are in the crime scene. You're seeing Will Graham, and he does his swoosh swoosh magic trick, his party trick, rewinds time, and it establishes everything immediately. Here are the components of your CSI style, slightly darker, gritty crime drama. This is what it's going to be. Here's what you're going to get every episode, and here's the mechanism. Here's what happens. And then it immediately starts to undercut itself beautifully. It starts to just introduce those little suggestions that it's maybe more than that. Maybe a little bit more. I mean, when I was watching it this afternoon, one of the things I was thinking about is how certainly in these early seasons, and I think it doesn't really last. It's something that sort of goes away in season 2. Will Graham literally rewinds time. You see like shattered vases regather themselves. You see blood fly off the wall. You see bullets going backwards, and so on and so forth. And I was thinking to myself, well, this is interesting because it's part of the odd metaphysics of the show. This is something that Hannibal talks about later on. It's part of one of Hannibal's very peculiar preoccupations, the notion that he wants the universe to sort of rewind on itself. He's not satisfied when a cup pushed off a table doesn't gather itself back up again. And that's what Will Graham does. That's his party trick, right? That's his entire character. I just found that absolutely fascinating.
Certainly, I think in the context of whether we look, if we accept the notion, which is strongly there anyway, which is Hannibal becomes fascinated with Will, maybe for a raft of reasons, but the idea that there's a sort of missing piece, that he can do something metaphysically speaking, that Hannibal would. So that's the thing I need. It's certainly one of the many ways that we can look at their relationship for sure.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because Hannibal doesn't strike you as an incomplete person. He strikes you as the kind, one of the very few characters who is entirely complete and of themselves. There is nothing they require. And yet, when he meets Will Graham, and I also think that it doesn't occur to Hannibal either. It wouldn't have occurred to him had he not met Will Graham that there was anything missing in him.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that really struck me watching it, despite the ground the three of us covered in the introductory episode, I was still quite taken aback how there was more, because we talked about Hannibal himself extensively, of course, because he is the link to the novels, to the films, to all of it. And yet still watching these first two episodes, I thought, we've barely scratched the surface with him. I mean, I know we talked about him being a kind of he has the blood of old feudal nobility in his veins and all that, and he is kind of a bourgeois figure writ large. I know we all talked about that, and but and it really comes through in this, how he is fascinating as a character, because he is in the Darwinian sense and in the social Darwinian sense, the one who is fully adapted to the bourgeois mode of production. His role, as with all the bourgeoisie, only they don't choose to confront it as Hannibal does, and it's really upfront in these two episodes, as the consumer of human meat and the drinker of human blood in an exploitative system, except he literally does it. And we get it right away. He's a psychiatrist and a physician, so he can go further. He can get into people's heads before he consumes them. Everyone is a potential area of study before they are consumed. And he of course understands the function of every organ, given his background, his training. And then you get this thing about this talent as a chef, and he is a gourmand, and he can then transform, through his own labor, which is, I mean, nothing alienated about his labor as a chef, because that's totally running on his own creative impulses, and everything is turned into fuel for his body. So we get, as we discussed last time, the cannibal, the vampire, and of course we weren't surprised when we said that he hails from the same turf as Dracula. But it's fascinating that you should say that, because in this episode, in Aperitif, there is a vampiric element to him. When he turns up at Will's house, shortly after they've been originally introduced, he lingers on the doorstep while Will is sort of half-period awake. And he says, "May I come in?" And he repeats it, and will not enter until Will has given him permission. And of course, I mean, it's like everything in the show. It operates on the level of metaphor. It's not just referring to the vampiric element, which is definitely there. It's also him asking, "Let me into your life. Let me into your mind. This is your sanctuary. It's your fortress," right? They talk about this when they first meet. In metaphorical terms, Will builds forts in his head, and Hannibal is all about breaking them down. And defiling them,
sense in which, there's a sense in which Hannibal does that all the time in all his relationships. He hangs back and he waits for permission, so to speak. It's like, I think it's what his fixation on politeness actually means, because what it actually signifies is that he is at every stage waiting for you to cooperate. On some level, what he wants to do is do what he does, but to some extent anyway, your invitation. He does it. Even the phone call that he makes to Hobbs,
to Garrett,
he repeats. He says to him, "Are you listening?" It's like he's waiting for confirmation that the man is actually interested in what he's going to say, and that he's got his attention before he says it. He does things like that all the way through. I noticed it in these episodes. And that's really interesting, because it directly, one of the things I noticed rewatching these is the emphasis that's put on Jack Crawford as really a very intrusive individual. Almost the first thing he does when he meets Will, or formally meets Will, is he just reaches out and takes hold of Will's glasses. He just takes them off his face. He doesn't ask. He doesn't wait for an invitation. He just reaches out and picks them off Will's face. And he goes to see Hannibal, and he just walks in. Yeah. He walks into the private patient's leaving area for a start, and then he comes into the consulting room, and he just instantly starts looking through Hannibal's sketches and things like that. He is a guy who just doesn't respect other people's boundaries at all.
No, you see it with Hannibal, his interactions with Freddie Lowndes as well in the next episode, of course, when he uses his authority to basically, I mean, okay, Freddie Lowndes is awful. She's a terrible, terrible person. She's a tabloid journalist. She's like the worst of the worst. But he uses his authority to silence her with force.
Oh yeah, what he does in that, that's intimidation, that's extortion, it's all kinds of awful. And again, it's one of the ways in which the show is pretending to be a kind of a conventional police procedural show, where in almost all those sorts of shows, you're on the side of the, or you the audience are presumed to be. You are positioned as on the side of the hard-charging, maverick, no-nonsense, rule-breaking, cop, etc., etc. And whereas in this, it kind of it's very delicate and careful and interesting right out of the bat, because it shows you Freddie Lowndes' complete ruthlessness and lack of principle, but at the same time, I don't know. You don't feel in that scene that you're necessarily on Jack Crawford's side at all.
No, actually, it's a really troubling scene in many respects, and it's one of the ones that more starkly throws Jack into a more negative light. There will be more to come later on, and most of them with regards to his treatment of Will Graham, of course. It's that thing with Will's glasses when he invades one of Will's sanctums, actually, which is his seminar hall. It's his lecture hall. That entire interaction is a kind of microcosm of their entire relationship. He doesn't feel that Will is a real person. Will is a functionary. Will is there to perform a particular function, and to hell with his mental health, with whatever problems he's suffering.
He has qualms, but they're completely narcissistic. He wants to be reassured that he's doing the right thing. That's all he really cares. And
that's why he brings Hannibal in, of course. That's the entire reason Hannibal's there.
Why he brings Hannibal in. It's why he has those chats with Alana Bloom. And I found myself, it's difficult because Caroline Davanos is so insanely attractive, but I found myself really quite hostile. Really quite hostile to Alana in this, because she does this rather sanctimonious thing where she, all the way through, she's sort of resisting Jack Crawford and talking back to him and saying, obviously very vocally and obviously disapproving of what he's doing. And yet at every stage she gives in to him and she lets him get away with it. I realized watching these that she's enabling him. She's facilitating him. She's giving him the alibi that he needs to carry on doing. Just on the most basic level, he like goes to permission to use Will as his plaything, and she sets the condition. Well, you promised me that he won't get too close, and of course, immediately he gets too close. And she has a moment where she's like, "You told me he wouldn't get too close," which you believed that, did you, Alana? But then nothing comes of it. She doesn't then say, right, I'm going to tell Will that he needs to get out of this, or I'm going to report you to your superiors, or anything like that. She just goes along with it.
No, it doesn't come to an end until season 2, of course.
But how often Jack Crawford talks about Will as malfunctioning or broken or needing help, and then you suddenly realize, because I think Jack Crawford is a really interesting character, particularly where they set up this dichotomy about sort of rudeness and taste and all this thing. But he's the product, of course, of that sort of FBI factory. His whole raison d'etre has been about imperatives to keep everyone and everything in a state whereby they can be deconstructed and then reconstructed according to these actually very reductionist ideas about police procedure and the profiling and so on. And it really is it really comes through in the moments when he just treats Will like a like a puzzle box. It's like, well, he's a malfunctioning puzzle box.
Mm-hmm.
So, right, okay, we're already in a problem here because you're reaching out to psychiatrists like Hannibal. You're working with people. You're working with an empath, basically, and you're bringing in Alana. And yet, your fundamental view of human beings is that they're just sort of units.
Yep.
And they go wrong, and they might need fixing. It's a really interesting counter.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what the entire sort of essentially woo-woo pseudoscience stuff of FBI profiling is all about, right the way through, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a basic sort of banal core where you can say, well, statistically, the sort of person that does this sort of crime is likely to be this sort of just on the odds, just on the statistics that we have. But beyond that, they extrapolate it into a huge amount of just nonsense, really, just kind of, as I say, woo-woo nonsense that's dressed up as science. But and yet, of course, it's always cloaked in this very melodramatic and authoritarian moralism as well, which is summed up in Jack Crawford calling his squad or whatever it is the Museum of Evil Minds,
right?
Which is so. It's supposedly a science of psychology that he's doing and profiling, but it's cloaked in it's essentially the whole thing essentially is a kind of moralistic Christian outlook.
It's a freak show, isn't it? That's effectively it, and that's what Will is really reacting against with regards to that name. It makes it carnivalesque.
Yeah,
but the thing it seems to plug into, I thought, well, if there's a because I guess I'm quite reductionist myself, I thought if there's a thread that is bringing all these people together and there's a reason for this program to exist, what is it? And it just struck me. I thought, well, it's everyone in their way is trying to define what reality is, and everyone's got a different conception. The FBI conception, the Hannibal conception, Garrett Hobbs' conception, the second serial killer's conception, and then in the middle of it, the sort of nexus is Will, who is I don't want to start sounding like Jack Crawford, but he is an anomaly. And he's so interestingly set in contrast to Hannibal. He's not surrounded by the accoutrements of bourgeois society. His house is functional. He does not have a nuclear family. The place is full of dogs he's saved, which goes against Hannibal's sort of Darwinian ethic. And it struck me. I thought, well, there's something about Hannibal that this thing about rudeness, this thing about, as you say, the cup would gather itself up and be fine again. There's something about Hannibal that taps into this idea of the atomized, post-political, post-ideological. We're just all consumers now. And Will is the worst customer service operative in existence as far as our society would be concerned, because he's no affinity for small talk, eye contact issue. He doesn't gloss his emotions with platitudes. He's a loner. He's actually explicitly empathic. And I think it's that question mark over him that Hannibal goes, you're actually not only out of place in my conception of society, you run counter to it, but in a really, really interesting way. And I think that is where the obsession starts to grow. And Crawford's conception of reality, of course, is, as we said, it's all about units. But Hannibal kind of sees people as commodities, and Crawford sees people as deconstructible units. And Will is the only person who, without getting woo-woo about it myself, who sort of appreciates the idea of the spirit or the soul, because he's so deeply empathic.
Well, I imagine part of the problem that Hannibal has with Jack Crawford, because it isn't made explicit. It's not like, say, Hannibal's first patient who we see. There is a sequence where we see him, sort of having a bit of a breakdown, and Hannibal hands him a tissue, and he uses the tissue, crumbles it up, and puts it, instead of putting it in a bin or something to that effect, he puts it on a table in Hannibal's office, and there is just one of those serpentine flickers of barely emotion across Hannibal's face where he looks at the tissue, and this guy is done. This guy is finished. But Crawford, with Jack, there isn't anything that explicit. It seems to be a multitude of factors. I imagine that the fact that he operates according to this reductionist pseudo-psychiatry, which comes from FBI profiling, is in and of itself kind of like blasphemy to Hannibal.
Yeah, because Hannibal's method of therapy or psychology, what we see of it is very interesting. There's the scene where he's talking to Will, and Will works out, obviously because Hannibal wants to deliberately give the game away without Jack Crawford realizing that he's doing it. Will realizes that Hannibal is there to check on Will for Jack, and Will says, "Don't psychoanalyze me. You won't like me when I'm
psychoanalyzed." Brilliance.
But what Hannibal is doing is not psychoanalysis. And there's even, seem to remember a line elsewhere in the show where Hannibal refers to the religion of psychoanalysis.
Yes, actually, he calls it the dead religion of psychoanalysis.
Right. So he's very explicitly not a Freudian.
No, very explicitly not.
Which, good, thank you.
Yeah. He wouldn't be a very good psychiatrist if he were. Let's put it that way.
No. But what he's doing really is almost like empathy engagement. He's actually trying to empathize with Will and to show Will that he empathizes with him.
Yeah.
So he's meeting Will directly on his own ground. And that's, there's so much interesting here, because the sort of person who in the real world would kill somebody for a tiny slight, like dropping their snot rag on your table. Yeah. In the real world, that sort of person is pathetic, because they have a huge narcissistic swollen ego, which is covering up the fact that they're really insecure and inadequate, and they have to kill you
in many ways. Yeah.
The slightest disrespect robs them of all power and security, and the only way they can get it back is to actually murder you. That's pathetic in the real world. Yeah. Hannibal, we need to kind of cover this, I think. Yeah. In the real world, people that murder people are, whether they're serial killers or not, generally speaking, they're pathetic, stupid people.
Absolutely.
With nothing interesting about them at all. Hannibal is not. He's not even meant to be anything approaching a realistic depiction or a naturalistic depiction of serial killers or murderers or anything like that. This show is doing something completely other than that. So what is that? And I think it ties back into that rudeness thing. It ties back in, as I was saying, his concentration upon permission, upon getting people to cooperate with him, and also cooperating with other people on their terms, which he does all the time. And it really is. I think it's a kind of humanism. This is one of the. I've always struggled with this. Why is it that we feel, and I feel this. I don't know. Maybe you'll disagree, but I feel this when I watch this show. I feel that they're in some way, in some obscure way, despite the awful things that he does, Hannibal Lecter is kind of on our side. He's kind of our guy. I don't know. But
I think what is that?
I think it's.
So go on.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, for me, I always get the impression that he's kind of a quasi vice figure, more than a character. It's how can I track this? He's presented to us first and foremost, by those clothes, that car, that house, that expensive watch, the artworks. No one can connect a man like that with murder for the very reasons you've just illustrated, Jack. But also he has the cover of respectability, of course, and yet he is the murderer par excellence. But he cultivates, it seems to me. He's a quasi-vice character in the sense that I think he shows up a lot of the hypocrisies of the characters and institutions around him. But his modus operandi seems to be cultivating. And part of that cultivation is cultivating sanity, order, taste. He has the signs of wealth and professional achievement. He's well camouflaged. But of course, by his very presence, Hannibal as a character, or maybe a kind of an unusual mutant archetype, he is pointing out that none of these things that he represents are sane. There is nothing about society we are a part of that is sane. It's a bloody nightmare. It's war, it's genocide, it's wage labor, it's imperialism, it's patriarchy, it's torture porn, it's explicitly corrupt individuals and corrupt system. It's all madness under a veneer of culturally sanctioned civilization. And Hannibal absolutely represents that. He is totally savage, but he is coolly intelligent. He is cultivated, and he murders by design. He has his own raison d'etre for this. But I wonder, and I'm not really making a very logical case. I'm sort of saying these things as I'm thinking of them. But if, in a sense, he's a kind of, I say, like a quasi-Vice character. Does that make sense, or am I just...
I know what you're saying, because the Vice is the figure who in the Elizabethan and Jacobean stage he represents a particular vice, and the way he moves through the play, he illustrates or brings to the fore the vices of others, and you can look upon Richard III in his play as a vice figure. Sure. And one of the things that people don't understand about that character, because very often they only see his play, Richard III, and that in a heavily cut form, is that in the three Henry VI plays, in which, well, he's barely present in the... I don't think he's present at all in the first one. But anyway, you get lots of context about all these people, and who they are, and how this situation came to be, and so on. And then in the two Henry VI plays that he's in, he and then in his own play, he acts as a form of punishment, gradual, slow, historical punishment upon these people who, and then people think of him as like the cartoon villain. Well, you have to not realize the backstory and the actions of huge numbers of the people that he does terrible things to in his own play. You have to have not seen them in the previous Henry VI plays and so on in order to miss that point. And yeah, to see Hannibal as a figure who's bringing out the hypocrisies and the frailties of the people around him. I mean, I think that's absolutely true.
But the reason I say it's a quasi thing, I mean, I don't think it tracks too perfectly, but certainly when you bring in Garrett Hobbs, obviously as our antagonist, of the first episode, if this were CSI Baltimore, as it's purporting to be.
Serial killer of the week, right?
Yeah, serial killer of the week. I mean, he is set up to reflect Hannibal, of course. He eats human flesh.
Yep.
But Hobbes's pathology, of course, is rooted in a sort of perverted sense of romanticized honor. Whereas Hannibal murders and cannibalizes, it seems to me, to try and create a more ordered world around him, as a cultivated world to reference the word I used earlier, free of rudeness.
Yeah.
He's kind of the ultimate elitist insofar as he sort of wants rid of the hoi polloi, the riffraff. But I think what makes it funny, albeit in a macabre way, is that his targets are other bourgeoisie. He's not hunting down blue-collar workers. Yeah. He's clearing out the lesser elites from his own circle. So his own idea of the world flourishes, if you like. And I think he absolutely accepts the idea of a lower class, because he will rarely go among them, but the poor are always with us, etc., etc. But I think it sort of pokes through a little bit more once we have the serial killer of the week, and then in the second episode as well, because they're almost utopian in their conception. There's a romantic, perversely romantic thing going on with Garrett Hobbs, and there is a perversely romantic thing going on. I can't remember the name of the second serial killer, but the one who's basically planting people.
Yeah,
that's it. Yes. Theirs is, and it's specifically in the second episode, because he talks when he's wounded in the shoulder with Will about reaching out, and he realizes that Will wishes to reach out. Hannibal stands in opposition to all these people. He doesn't want to reach out in the same way. He perhaps wants to reach out to Will, but there's other things going on there. He wants to prune the garden. He doesn't want to see it flourish and extend. that's sort of where I feel Hannibal seems to exist.
It kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Elliot, when you talked to him as a cultivator. He's pruning, but he's also encouraging a very particular kind of growth. He wants the garden to be very specific. When he's contacting the serial killers, when he is cultivating them, he's seeing in them a kind of not only a fundamental humanity, which he also perceives in himself, but also an artistry. It seems that what he's doing with these characters, with these people, is he's encouraging them to transcend themselves, to become a sort of higher state, if you like, living artistry as he sees it, and this is the way they can be that, by transgressing, by being more than culture and society prescribes for them. And it's interesting that it goes back to what Jack was saying earlier. This world, this entire universe in which these characters operate, it's not just Hannibal that's ascended. This entire world is removed from our own, in the sense that serial killers in this world are not these powerfully pathetic individuals. They are creatures of bizarre empathy and artistry and connection to other human beings that are trying to express something fundamental. And that's one of the ways in which the show makes itself more. It's one of the ways in which it actually it removes itself from that criticism, because of course one of the problems with shows and media about serial killers, and certainly in the way that they are hyper mythologized, is that mythology then seeps back into culture, and we tend to have this distorted view of what serial killers and psychopaths are, which, as Jack says, they are pathetic individuals. In reality, they're absolutely worthless individuals who are deficient in a number of critically human ways. In this universe, that's not the case, and it establishes that very, very early on. But it's not just the serial killers, it's everyone, right? It's absolutely everyone. Everyone in this universe has a kind of interiority, from the repulsive tabloid journalist to FBI agents. They all talk in this ascended and poetic way about their own motivations and their thought processes in ways that no real human beings do. And that's because this universe is several steps removed from ours.
Yeah, and that's why it's very important that it opens stylistically with that very surreal, essentially a very surreal sequence where you see it immediately drops you into a scene where Will, just psychically, in the sense that it happens inside his psyche, turns back time. With the use of a kind of magic pendulum, and you see time being reversed, and you see him taking on the role of the killer of the family at the start, and so it opens with a completely surreal heightened sequence. So it's telling you right from the start that in a funny way, at both at once, it's doing the same thing both at once. It's saying, yes, I'm CSI Baltimore, as we keep saying, but at the same time it's saying also I'm not. I'm also this weird surreal thing that makes no claims to being realistic or gritty in the same way that these sorts of shows do.
And also I am a television programming time-lapse rewound footage. Startling use of Foley.
And killing is immediately a work of aesthetics. It's immediately presented as a work of art, and that I think is the key to it, because I think what the killers are in this series is artists. And I think that's key to Hannibal as well, because the word you kept using, Elliot, was cultivate, and that works very well in the sense that you were using it, that Hannibal is cultivating, but he's also very, what we would call, cultivated with his his clothes and his food and his lifestyle, etc. And I think what Hannibal is interested, the thing that makes me feel that he's kind of on our side, that he's kind of our guy in a strange way, is that he strikes me as being really, really interested in people. This version of Hannibal, in a way that you can't. The previous versions of Hannibal don't get anywhere near this. You can't imagine any of those previous versions of Hannibal living in the world and interacting with people. The only way they exist is in a cage in a mental asylum. Whereas this Hannibal, we immediately see him interacting with people out there in the world, and he likes them. He likes people. He finds people interesting. And what he's doing all the way through these two episodes, I think he's not always scheming scheming. Like the Hannibal in the Silence of the Lambs and whatever. Everything he says, everything he does is a scheme. It's a plan. He's thinking, this version of Hannibal, exactly. This version of Hannibal is not doing that. This version of Hannibal is just kind of throwing the dice and see what happens. He just wants to see what happens.
He says that himself, doesn't he? Later on in the show.
He will stir the water to get things moving because he just wants to see what people will do. He's
very spontaneous, isn't he? I mean, the phone call is spontaneous. Even the faked murder is, well, it's not a fake murder, but the copycat. It feels very spontaneous.
It is spontaneous, and it's also an expression of affection for Will as well. It's an early expression of affection. He says in the previous scene,
emotionally impulsive.
I can help Will to see the face of this killer, see the face of this cannibal, and of course that works on multiple levels. He's talking about Garrett Jacob Hobbs, but he's also talking about himself, and that what Will describes as the scene of field kabuki. It's a gift wrapped crime scene from Hannibal, right? And it's there so that Will can see the truth of the real killer of Garrett Jacob
Showing
Hobbs.
him the negative so that he can see the positive. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think Hannibal means, in his own twisted terms of reference, Hannibal means well. I don't think he's not doing that cynically, and I don't think he approaches his patients. This is how Mads plays it. I don't think he approaches his patients cynically. I don't think he necessarily approaches the interesting new job of being involved with the FBI. Oh, this is interesting, isn't it? A whole new set of people that I can watch. I don't think he necessarily approaches that cynically.
I don't think so either. I mean, there is towards the end. Towards the end of this episode, when Will and Hannibal arrive at Garrett Jacob Hobbs' place of work, Will asks Hannibal, "What are you smiling about?" And Hannibal is sat there in the car, and he says, "Oh, I'm behind the curtain. I'm peeking behind the curtain. I get to see what's going on. What the FBI operate like, and it's a game. It's fun."
I think the other side of just thinking. Sorry. Go on.
He enjoys us. He enjoys us, and this is why he's a humanist. He's almost the satanic humanist in the sense that he just loves us. Yeah. He's not one of us. He doesn't feel that he's human. No. And the series all the way through continually and wonderfully, the thing it does is it never resolves this. It continually, one way or the other, it continually provides you with the ability to interpret everything in it as possibly supernatural or possibly just figurative. So, if you want Hannibal to be a demon or a Wendigo or whatever, then you can do that. But
what he is, right?
Whatever that is, whatever the truth of that is, the truth, whatever that is, Hannibal certainly doesn't feel like one of us. He feels like he's on the outside looking in. But the thing is, it's not a sad thing because he just finds us so bloody interesting. Yeah. And it's that almost sort of loving paternal humanism where he just loves everything we do, everything we do that's creative, everything we do that's thoughtful. And
first episode
chucking aside your snot rag is not creative. It's not thoughtful. It's just loutish and thuggish and selfish and uninteresting. Whereas, in Hannibal's worldview, killing people, that might be interesting if you do it for interesting reasons and in an interesting way, and you take your time over it and you do it artistically. Yeah, that can be interesting. I think that's where that ties in for me with the whole idea of cultivation, because he loves everything that humans do, including the food that we've created, the music that we've created, the finer things in life, you could say, and he includes in that art, and includes in the realm of art, he includes things like murder if it's a certain kind of murder, and he's cultivated in that sense. And he's like a patron of the arts.
Yeah. Now this is really, I find this take on it really fascinating because one person I sort of wanted to at least mention, because she did a run through of the entire series, is El Sandifer on the Eruditorium Press. Basically did a short review of every single episode, and there's one point, it's related to what you're saying, Jack, about the art connotations and so on, and in one of Elle's reviews she says, well, if Hannibal is the artist, then Will is the critic. And I thought, oh, that's great. That's really nice. And it really was helpful for me to read that, because as I said to you in the first episode that we did, well, we were sort of running through how this thing with Thomas Harris was very much in the cultural air through the 90s, and you get it in the films of David Lynch and The X-Files and Damien Hirst and that kind of neo-paganism and Nine Inch Nails video promos. But I said one of the things for me that really defines that strain of culture in the 90s was the Outside album by David Bowie. And I'm going to have to keep going back to that as a lens, because it's a damn good one for me, because I've listened to that album since I was 16, but I've only ever read the Harris books once, and I've only ever seen the series once before. But when L. Sandifer said that, it resonated, because I thought, well, in Outside, the antagonist is described variously as the voyeur or the minotaur. We've got a lot of imagery with horns in these 2 episodes of Hannibal. Or simply the artist, someone who commits murders as art. That's the premise of Outside, or as Will Graham sees it, murder by design. And the Will Graham analog in Outside is a character called Nathan Adler, who of course David Bowie plays. But he's a detective rather than, Will's a kind of detective, but he's more of a kind of traditional gumshoe, Columbo-esque detective. But like Will, Nathan Adler is both detective and critic simultaneously. He doesn't have the same insights as Will Graham. But both of them have the same thing, and which is, it's my job to go through the manure pile looking for peppercorns. And that is basically what Will has to do. And so I just as a sort of, oh my God, he's banging on about that again. I think it's just going to be a lens I'm probably going to use quite a lot in this, because the overlap is amazing. And I think it's because David Bowie was a proper thief and culture vulture by his own admission, and it read the Thomas Harris novels. But that's great. I'm just going to steal loads of that. But hitting on the idea of the murderers, a lot of the featured murderers in this series, and Hannibal himself as kind of artistically driven, and Will as a kind of art critic, not a Jonathan Jones. And when L mentioned that, I thought that's a really good framework.
Dynamically, it really works. It really works, because Hannibal does point this out to Will. I don't think it's in this season, actually. I think it's much later on. He says to him something along the lines of, you delight in atrocity and in killing, but then you berate yourself for it. Will is the critic that wants to be an artist, right?
Yeah.
But there's something stopping him. There's something stopping him. And what you see, it's even here in these very first episodes, you're seeing Hannibal perceiving that and starting to just drip feed those little suggestions into Will's mind that eventually end up almost turning him into that very creature. There's at the very end of Amuse Bouche, he starts talking about God, of course, and he says to Will, God must delight in killing. He does it all the time.
Yeah,
he does it all the time.
Yeah. And it's an example of this wonderful thing the show does, where it takes things from the original novels and recontextualizes them. In the I believe that exchange is in Red Dragon. It is Hannibal talking to Will from inside hospital, and in the book it's just a dig. It's just him needling Will. It's just him being it reads as him being self-consciously shocking and trying to upset Will, and so much of what he does so much of what he says to Will in that novel just seems like him just needling and trying to hurt. It's spiteful, yeah, exactly. Whereas this Amuse Bouche recontextualizes and reconfigures that conversation and makes it this very close and intimate exchange of empathy between these two men. Hannibal is trying to make Will feel better about the fact that Will has experienced enjoyment in the act of killing, which horrifies Will. And this gets at something I think is really interesting, because I was saying before about how Jack Crawford has this really heavy-handed moral condemnation thing sort of sprinkled as garnish on top of what is really a very functionalistic and utilitarian worldview. And I think that they keep on talking about Will's personality as an empathy disorder, as if the ability to empathize with everybody and everyone is kind of a failing, as if it's a malfunction. Whereas in actual fact, the ability to empathize with anybody is actually, I think, what the vast majority of the human race do to some extent, most of the time, and it's what enables us to live in societies, really. So the idea that there's something unhealthy or debilitating about being empathic is really interesting, and it's the world that Will lives in. The world that Will lives in has kind of managed to convince him that there's something wrong with him because he's able to feel empathy for terrible people.
And isn't it interesting that the only person... Sorry, Jack.
It's that really heavy-handed, moralistic attitude towards crime where the moment you start trying to understand why people do dreadful things, the minute you start trying to approach them as human beings, the minute you start trying to understand how their crimes are rooted in their own unhappiness and their own history of abuse, or their own the stuntedness and the frustration of their own lives, and so the minute you just try to understand it, which in order to understand why anybody does anything, you have to empathize with them. You are instantly smacked down by this performative, how dare you? Are you saying that they're you just have to look upon people that do dreadful things, you're just pure evil. And that's it. And if you try to do anything other than that, you're condemned and people are suspicious of you. Whereas, as I always say, it's actually that view of people, where people just do things because they are innately evil, that's the one that lets them off the hook. The one where you try to understand why people who do dreadful things, the worldview where you try to understand them as human beings and their crimes are rooted in neuroses and abuse and stuff like that, that's the one that actually allows you to view them as responsible, because it's the worldview that allows you to see them as agents. But that is not, it's like the entire force of this institutional, moralistic, inherently judgmental Christian worldview. It's really weird, because built into this whole idea of the profiler and trying to catch the killer by getting into their psyche, which is bollocks. But the whole idea of that is based upon treating them as people, and yet all the way through, everybody has to pretend that they're not people and that you can't empathize with them. So, and that's really the disjunct that Will is trying to cope with. He's trying to cope with the fact that he can get into the heads of these people because they are fellow human beings, and he's able to see himself in them and stuff like that. And it's like all this moralistic condemnation, performative moralistic condemnation, has convinced him that something that he does that's very human and very constructive and very healthy is actually something to be ashamed of. And that feeling of shame that he has, that's actually the vulnerability that allows Hannibal to get in, isn't it?
It is, and it's interesting, isn't it, that Hannibal is one of the only characters who doesn't see it as a disorder or as a failing. In fact, he regards Will as the diamond in the rough, right? He is the most beautiful psyche he's ever come across.
But I think we also, I think to understand that, Hannibal almost has to be seen almost as, I think he in a sense sees himself or perceives himself either consciously or unconsciously as a kind of Ubermensch, as a kind of Superman. And it's interesting that Christianity and Christian moralism and all these things are referenced, because Hannibal it seems to me linked to that Nietzschean idea of the exaltation of life rather than the exaltation of suffering. So every drive, every lust, every sensual event for Hannibal is just as valid, and so it exists. Beyond good and evil. Hannibal is himself beyond good and evil, and I think this is one of the things that when Jack says about I'm fascinated by human beings, is that sort of, we talked about Milton's Lucifer last time, but man and beast are not separate. So Hannibal, as I was making a bit of a mess of trying to say earlier, is not a hypocrite. He's dangerous, he's a murderer, but he exists at a sort of extreme as an extreme person. He embodies a kind of philosophical place that dares to poke beyond the values and ethics that have been co-opted into liberal secularism from Christianity and Christian moralism. So there's an awful lot of master-slave morality going on in Hannibal's implicit philosophy. I mean, he is a figure from which I think we dare probe the limits and validity of all ethical codes that we drape over things, especially when they're replete with hypocrisy. Which I think plugs back into this idea of him being, as I say, a sort of quasi-vice character. But yeah, absolutely. Those things are definitely carrying through.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It seems to me that he rejects entirely judgment with regards to any kind of orthodoxy all the way through these shows. And in fact, it's true in the books as well, to a lesser degree. He is shown to reject any kind of prescribed ideology at all. He talks about, even in his own field, things like Freudianism and Jungianism. And I believe it's described at one point that he does not regard, in fact, it's Barney, and interestingly, a character who doesn't appear in the Hannibal show, but who is quite significant in the books. Barney, the nurse who attends to Hannibal in Chilton's dungeon, says that Hannibal doesn't regard psychiatry as a science. It's an art. It's intuitive.
I think he just sees every human endeavor that's of any worth as being essentially some form of art. Art is just the one word catch-all for everything that humans do that is of worth, that's creative, that's interesting, etc., etc. And anything that's of any value fits into that to one extent or another. It's pure aestheticism.
Yeah. Well, what he flirts with, I mean, if you start factoring in things like Thomas de Quincey, murder considered as one of the fine arts, that idea that we all should absolutely be observed and critiqued from an aesthetic point of view more than a moral or sociological one. That's what Hannibal is flirting with. Even as this show, as we said, co-ops the police procedure mode. A murderer's style should be considered, and that's in the show. And how we should be able to criticize, as you said, Jack, how and why murder unfolds according to taste without freighting in the kind of moralism that actually stops it dead in its tracks.
But De Quincey, of course, is engaged. That essay is satire, isn't it? And it's actually under the hood. It's a kind of rather. I don't appreciate it much myself. I find it rather leaden and smug and sort of inherently elitist, I'm afraid.
Oh yeah,
and Hannibal is completely post-ideological. He doesn't have political concerns of any kind. He just doesn't think in those terms. He, as you say, he's not going after blue-collar people, and he wouldn't decide who to kill based on that. If he met there was a guy that was, in the rubbish truck taking his rubbish away, but the man was interesting.
Yes,
Hannibal would just view him. He is an elitist. He is an elitist. He does believe inherently in the idea of people who are better than other people, but it's fundamentally it's a kind of romantic, capital R romantic elitism, where it's the special people who are of the tribe of the artists, of the creative tribe, etc. And they might be dustmen, whereas people who are in the Baltimore State Orchestra, if they're not sufficiently good at the flute, they are not deserving of special treatment, and so you put them in the soup. That's his elitism.
Right, Garrett Jacob Hobbs is a working class, isn't he? Garrett Jacob Hobbs is an engineer, isn't he, or something? He's a plumber or something to that effect. So, absolutely, and his regard for
creative.
Yes, that's it.
Because he's creative, and his psyche is interesting and animated, and so on and so forth, and complex. And Hannibal views him almost as a colleague, to the point where he shows him a professional courtesy.
Right, he's someone who's worthy, right?
Yeah. Of course, Chilton isn't in the show yet, but Chilton is, technically speaking, he is a colleague of Hannibal's, but he's of no interest to Hannibal whatsoever, except as a sort of puppet that he can play around with.
Sometimes an occasional chew toy.
Chew toy, exactly. That's what there's nothing going on in there. There's nothing going on in there that Hannibal finds interesting. No, there's no creativity. There's no spark of, and there's no empathy as well. Chilton doesn't really care about other people.
No.
Hannibal's not interested in that.
No, he's so self-involved, doesn't he? I wonder if the question around everything, from Hannibal's perspective, this fascination with Will, around everything that Will does, going back to this idea that, if Hannibal is the artist, then Will is, in a sense, the critic. Will kind of reforms crime scenes into, from one perspective, you could argue he reforms crime scenes into art.
Yeah.
Or does the art inherent in the killer's intention do that? Does Will take all that carnage and elevate it to something spiritual or artistic by by what he does, his mechanism? Is this why Hannibal finds something in him? Because
he's the critic as creative, isn't he?
He's the critic as creator. Yes, that's it, isn't it?
The best criticism, as I think E.M. Forster wrote a brilliant essay about this, if I remember rightly.
Rewriting.
The best critic is the one who approaches his response to art as itself an artistic project. Criticism as artistry.
So I do wonder if one of the reasons that Hannibal hitches his wagon to Will, so to speak, rather than anyone else, is he's elevating things that seem like artistic works of murder by this mechanism that he possesses and his ability to frame it. It's, as you say, he is an artist via being a critic, and he might be elevating it further.
Yeah, one of the very first visual images that the show insists upon is the image of the blood splatter on the wall near the alarm system thing, the keypad for the alarm system. And again, it works on two levels, because on the one level it allows it to cosplay as CSI Baltimore, because anybody that watches those sorts of crime shows or watches stuff about true crime knows all about blood splatter analysis and all that sort of thing. It's a big thing inside that whole genre of television program, whether it's true crime or fictional crime, or whatever. So it's doing that, but it's also it's showing you what is in effect a kind of abstract art. It makes me think of one of the things that's interesting about Pollock canvases is that what you have when you look at a Pollock canvas, you have a record in space, in two-dimensional space. You have a record in color and shape and line, etc. But what it is, it's a record of human action. It's a record of human gesture and human motion, because the lines that you have are the lines of the paint that is being dribbled and drooled onto the canvas by the human hand, and it moves this way and that because the artist is pulling his hand this way and walking this way around the canvas, etc. So you have like a map of the very act of the painting's creation itself. Theoretically, you could trace everything that the artist did as they were creating, everything that Pollock did as he was creating the canvas, from just reconstructing his motions from following the lines on the canvas. And that's almost exactly what Will does. The first thing he does is he does this reverse engineering. You see the blood flying back off the wall, and that I think is exactly what it's getting at. It's getting at the murder as an aesthetic tableau, and then it's getting into it as an act of creation, as an act of creativity, destruction as an act of creativity.
And Pollock's work has that additional quality because of the form it takes. You can actually see temporally, because you can see the earlier movements of paint underneath the later movements of paint.
Yes, exactly. You have a palimpsest quality.
It's a palimpsest, and Will's visionary acts like a palimpsest. He erases tape. He gets to the bit where he rewinds tape.
It insists upon that happening in stages as well.
Yes,
the pendulum goes one way and you see one aspect disappear, and then it goes the other way and you see another aspect of the tableau disappear until you get back to the clean canvas that it was at the start.
That's right. It becomes less explicit as the show goes on and as the sort of more formulaic elements go away. But in these early episodes, it's absolutely explicit. The sequence in Amuse Bouche when he recreates the mushroom garden is exactly that. The magic pendulum comes along and sweeps away elements consistently until you just get a clean field.
And the whole thing in that episode, the whole point of the exercise for Stamets is this quest for empathy, this quest for direct
connection,
human mind to mind connection, the ability to understand. And of course, it ties in with psilocybin mushrooms and stuff like that. And the whole one of the great things about those sorts of hallucinogenics. I've never used them myself, but I know the discourse around them is that they create the ability for unfettered empathy without barriers between human beings.
I mean, it's not. I actually haven't tried those in particular, but there is another substance that I've tried which used to have the street name of empathy before it was recategorized as ecstasy, and that has that effect.
Yeah,
it makes you feel connected.
Absolutely, yeah. MDMA makes you feel intimately and completely unashamedly connected, just on a level of pure benevolence.
Everyone is fascinating.
Everyone is fascinating. Everything that is human is suddenly fascinating to you. That's what Hannibal walks through life in a constant state of MDMA arousal.
I think that's a really good description of him, to be perfectly honest. His ascended state of mind. Yeah. I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
In Will, for the first time, it's almost sad. It's like, you can extrapolate. He's been lonely because as fascinating as he finds people, he doesn't connect with them. He watches. He is a voyeur. There is a voyeurish quality about him in these early episodes where he just sort of walks around and watches people and listens to them. But he can't actually get to them. And he starts to have a direct contact with somebody, the somebody who is like him, the somebody who has that sort of open wound quality, as it were, with other people and can't connect to them because he's overloaded by the input that they send out.
And it works both ways as well, of course. It's also it's true of Will and it's true of Hannibal as well. And there is a sort of subtextual way in which they discuss it in Aperitif when they first meet in Crawford's office. Hannibal tells Will, I can't turn off mine any more than you can turn off yours.
Yeah.
He's constantly drawing parallels between them, constantly. And Will, when Will eventually, this is much later on, but when Will eventually, sees him for the first time and realizes who and what he actually is, that of course appalls Will and he denies it. But of course, it's something he can't deny for very, very long.
Yeah.
Because I think
one of the things that really struck me actually about then, Will and Hannibal, was I was quite surprised to say, this is only my second ever viewing, how quickly that situation between them starts to take shape and how it does so. I mean, it really fascinated me on this viewing, knowing where it goes, how Hannibal maneuvers himself into Will by all sorts of means, through his gut as well as his mind. I mean, when he feeds him the human flesh and the breakfast scene, it is such a complete violation. The start of a merging and entwining of the two of them.
But of course, from Hannibal's perspective,
much earlier
it's
than
a decent thing. He's not doing it malevolently.
No, it is. I mean, as I say, I think the easiest word to go to is violation, but I think for Hannibal, it's entwining.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If Hannibal were capable of seeing that for what it actually is, he wouldn't be Hannibal. To him, it's an act of intimacy. It's an act of reaching out. It's an act of trying to contact again. Yeah,
and sharing. Like it's an act of sharing. We're both having this experience together.
Yeah.
As is the plagiarism, the copycat murder, which of course has a dual function, really. I mean, it's a clue in that police procedural sense that's laid by Hannibal, but it's also Hannibal playing with the idea of a designed murder to to fire Will's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I love the fact that it's a repro. Then you're into this. It would lack the aura of the original for Will.
And there's also an element of it. There's also an element of self-exposure.
Wants to see what happens.
Yes.
But he also wants to be seen. I mean, I don't know if Hannibal even understands this at this point. I don't know if he actually gets this about himself. But after meeting Will, he realizes that there is someone in the world who can know him utterly, who can assume his perspectives in ways that no other human being can. Because of course he is fundamentally inhuman. And he wants to be seen by Will.
Because this version of Hannibal, much as he is still kind of the Ubermensch, the almost supernatural Ubermensch. This version of Hannibal is not a Hannibal who completely understands his own mind. He is a Hannibal with interiority, and again in a way that no previous version that we've seen has interiority, and that includes an inability to fully understand himself, which is really interesting. I mean, who would have thought that they'd make a TV show out of the Hannibal Lecter stories, and you wouldn't just go for the most obvious route of having him as kind of this big bad, just the ultimate evil on the fringes of the show. To go there with it, I still don't quite believe this show happened.
I can't. No, every single time I'm absolutely incredulous. And it operates on a number of levels as well. It's the aesthetic elements too. I mean, even this early on, you are starting to get those bizarre dream sequences where you get odd surreal symbolism happening. You start to get the gradual emergence of the imagery of the fawn like satyr creature, which hasn't quite swollen in Will's mind yet. It isn't quite born completely yet, but you're starting to see its elements coalescing. You even start to get the seasoning of elements which will come later, and I have no idea. I can't tell whether this is deliberate, whether this was actually these are ideas that they had early on and they wanted to seed them at this point, or whether it's just a case of they put them in and then developed them later on into what they would become. But you start to get things like suggestions of Will's encephalitis, for example. Even this early on, there's a sequence in this very first episode where he is in a fevered sweat and having a terrible nightmare. And when he wakes up, he looks terrible. He looks ill.
Yeah. And you have to give Hugh Dancy huge props, I think. What a difficult role. What a difficult role.
So difficult. So difficult.
Does a marvelous job with it.
We're playing with so many complexities, and it's so many, in many respects, like inhuman characteristics of something that's entirely other than human, almost demi-human, and pulling it off, really pulling it off.
So much of, on paper, so much of Will looks and sounds just like this insufferable asshole, to be honest with you.
It's true.
But it's true. He manages to make him intensely sympathetic.
Yeah. It's the vulnerability, I think, isn't it? That's what it is. Hugh brings a certain vulnerability to the character, but it's not unambiguous. I mean, Hannibal notices it. Hannibal says to him at one point that Jack regards him as the finest china, only to get out at special occasions, and also quite fragile. Whereas, Will asks him, "Well, how do you see me?" And he says, "As the mongoose that scurries under the house when the snake slithers by."
Wow. That's a really interesting exchange, isn't it? Because even Will says, "I don't quite know how to take that."
Right, and
I don't quite know what that means.
You're not supposed to, because of course the mongoose is that interesting ambiguity of being both the prey animal and the predator animal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's almost like Hannibal. It's almost like Hannibal is saying, if I were ever in danger, I feel like I could rely on you to protect me.
Yeah.
If a monster came for me, then I could, and again, it feels sincere. So what is it that Hannibal thinks might be coming for him that he thinks Will might protect him from? Again, it's so interesting. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know.
I do sincerely think that at this point, their relationship is nascent, and Hannibal doesn't understand why he's responding to Will in the way that he's responding, why he's so interested in this guy. You start to see elements of it later on. This is moving forward a little bit, but you start to see elements in his exchanges with Bedelia du Maurier when she's acting as his psychiatrist, where he's talking about his confusions with regards to Will, and he doesn't really know where Will stands with regards to him and his life and what he wants from Will. And she tells him. She actually does see. She tells him at one point that it's nice to be seen, Hannibal. Yeah. But your problem is that you can't be by most people. They don't know other human being can actually understand you, apart from this man who has this almost nice supernatural capability for empathy.
And also, just, if somebody did really see you, you'd be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, that's that too.
He has to hide. Yeah. He has to hide, and that's his tragedy. In order to be himself, he has to hide.
Mm-hmm. Except with Will, of course, later on, and he wants to be seen. Yeah, he wants to be seen by him. He likes Will.
Yeah.
He fundamentally wants Will in his existence. And what I love is the way in this first episode, Will totally rejects him. And in quite a rude way, actually. I mean, he very casually tells her, you're not that interesting. Yeah, you don't interest me. And that's the end of it.
Hannibal, I think, tries to get that initial thing, because his way into meeting Will is that he's been brought in by Crawford to analyze him. And in that scene where he very obviously, he deliberately blows what's going on, he clues Will into what he's doing there. Yeah. You feel like he's trying to get that out of the way, so that we can get past the initial hostility, which is inevitable.
Yeah. In fact, that occurs quite a lot in these first two episodes, where he is not interested in sort of the formal structure, the prescribed relationship that Crawford wants for them. He wants Will on his own terms. So he does things like, for example, he rubber stamps Will's psych evaluation.
Yes.
That's out of the way. Don't care about that. Not interested. There you are. You can operate as freely as you want.
It creates this fascinating dynamic between them, where they're kind of the naughty schoolboys in on it together, going behind teachers' back.
Yeah. He is drawing conspiracy with Will. He's so
copying,
when you look
copying
under
each other's homework, and the teacher won't find out.
He's so there's almost like beneath the quiescence and the stillness, the poise of Mads's performance, there is this quiet desperation where Hannibal really, 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 really wants this friend to be in his world and in his wheelhouse.
It's notable how often and again it's coming back to it, but with a somewhat fresh eye, how much that Mads Mikkelsen puts in tiny giggles, smiles, and his eyes, and you think, yes, this is not someone playing an archetypal, cool, detached, psychopathic character. He's not, and he as an actor gets it, and it's he's almost he gets excited, he gets quietly excited, and it's and then of course it becomes strangely charming.
Absolutely. I mean, and also very, very sympathetic. It's much later on, it's after Will has developed his encephalitis, and Will doesn't turn up for one of their sessions.
Yeah.
And it's this quiet moment where there's no dialogue whatsoever, and Hannibal is sat at his table waiting for Will. And he opens his journal where he has all of his appointments, and he double checks it, and he checks it again. And Will still hasn't turned up. And there is this flicker of sadness.
Where is he?
But because you have these Hannibal is reflected and reflected and reflected and reflected through all the various other characters, and there was a point where, because as we know, Harris and then Fuller by extension, they really go for this thing about loaded names, but the idea of Jacob Hobb, and Hobb being from folklore, the mischievous household spirit. But that's kind of Hannibal in this episode, because of course that reflection is there. Hannibal is playing the mischievous household spirit. He's so excited and excitable, and he's more Hobb than Hobb.
Yeah. Absolutely, and you see that in the way that Will mythologizes him in his own mind. I mean, the satyr figure has elements of Garrett Jacob Hobbs's imagery. It has the antlers.
Yeah, and of course that whole imagery. I did warn you that I was going to sort of probably slightly bang on about this of the horns. Again, something that's very it's the motif for the Outside album, and I mean, I think Bowie was going in more along the lines of things like Roman bull worship and things like that. The Minotaur, I mean, he specifically says about the Minotaur, but this impression of presumably Hannibal with horns, and then you were saying earlier about the Christianity and so on. I mean, we're well into the area like the drinking of the blood and the eating of the meat. So it's Mithras and it's transubstantiation, and then Hannibal's making cracks about the Catholic Church and ritual. I mean, the whole murderer's art thing in Hannibal, as in Outside, it's ritual. Whether it's just religiosity or there is actually faith in there. And of course, the fascinating thing, as I found out, I didn't realize this for years and years and years, is how far back the Minotaur predates the Greeks.
Oh yeah.
But all that ritualistic aspect, the by design, murderer's art, murderer's design, it can be even traced into just the symbolism of the horns. It's all there. It's fascinating, but I love how Will's impression of Hannibal it carries so much weight in that symbolism, whereas of course in Hannibal's own office there is an inert stag's head, isn't there? Just and then of course all the bleached bones in Garrett Jacob Hobbs' workshop, and it's just all dovetailing together. It's great. It is so beautiful, striking,
framed gorgeously as well.
In fact, it's one of the things, because we were saying about how it uses the form of a police procedure to undercut it, and yet at the same time, I think it's quite interesting in these early episodes. I think the pilot is pretty damn brilliant.
Yeah.
What I think about the first episode is that they have just a slight wobble. I think all the business of the characters is great, and basically the pulse of what Hannibal is there. But I felt the schematic was the problem that week, because you have to remind me of his name again. The second serial killer,
Stamets,
yeah.
Eldon Stamets.
That's it. That plot felt quite underdeveloped, and it was so interesting, and the imagery was so striking. I thought this is that felt a little bit more consciously used as a kind of armature to get us into the rest of the story, whereas in the pilot with the Garrett Jacob Hobbs plotline, it felt much better, much more integrated, much more seamlessly integrated. Whereas it just felt to me watching it like, oh right, okay, this is our hook, and we won't run with this. And of course they don't run with it.
Just on a purely aesthetic level, how did you guys respond to the people who were used as the beds for the mushrooms when you first see that image?
It's a wonderful image.
It's
incredibly
beautiful. It's gross as well. Of course, it's absolutely grotesque, especially when the FBI agents are disinterring them.
Yeah. I have a particular aversion to fungus. I hate mushrooms and toadstools. I loathe them. So yeah, particularly upsetting to me, to be honest, just on the level of my personal dislike of fungus. of any
It's the level of detail they go for as well. I mean, like you can see sort of lymphatic fluid and pus and all sorts of stuff where these things are growing. And of course, there's the obvious reference to Seven, where one of them is it's the sloth moment, isn't it? One of them is alive and like lurches up. God knows how, given the state of the person, but there we are.
It's interesting you should say that, Jack, because I remember certainly, it's just getting a bit anecdotal, when I was younger, if I saw fungus mushrooms in the wild growing against trees, or just the very, very strange, I say, unease about it, to the point as a child I would kick it all away. I'd get rid of it. Yeah. If I saw it creeping up trees, I would kick it with the toe of my shoe, or if it was in grass, I mean, I don't do that now because I just think, but interesting how that comes through as a childish impulse. Then I don't like it, therefore I'm going to wreck it. Yeah. So seeing that in the context of how it's done in that second episode, there was a definite. Oh my God! Oh,
it's fascinating how like this particular serial killer recontextualizes what mushrooms and fungus actually generally mean to human beings, which is of course their images of rot and decay, and mortality. Whereas here they're reconfigured to be images of connection and empathy, meeting mind to mind.
One thing that was punched the air brilliant though, and it was something that my partner pointed out. When they enter the pharmacy, I think you're primed to think they're at the wrong one.
Yeah.
That trick that the CSIs and the various police procedures do, where they set up a sequence, and then you find that they're in the one across town, and
That's right.
Don't pull it. They don't pull it in this episode, but it looks as though they're about to pull it, but this thing about undercutting or subverting expectations of that format, you're absolutely prepared for them to go, well, we're in the wrong chemists, or this is the right one. And they don't. They're in the right one. He just happens to have been a little bit smarter and a little bit faster than them. Yeah. And it's just a great little moment. It's like, because it's become such cliche, and it was cliche even when that came out. To pull that stunt, really. So it's like,
yeah. Well done for not going for the obvious, right?
Absolutely.
I think these episodes are. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Go ahead, Jack.
I think these episodes are quite remarkable in that how straight out of the box they pretty much nail perfectly the aesthetic they want. The wonderful use of overexposure and underexposure in the filming. The combination of low levels of light, and they obviously are using filters a lot of the time, but also they fill the color palette of the episode. It has lots of deep reds and deep purples and deep blues, very rich, deep versions of primary colors all over the place. And they're quite bright, even despite the fact that a lot of the time the picture is quite murky. Through the murk, you have these very bright colors. And just instantly, this show has its own feel. Yeah, it just has its own completely unmistakable feel and its own sense of integrity.
How they choose to present those characters as well. I mean, the look of someone like Freddie Lowndes, Hannibal himself, Alana. It hovers on stylization. And
absolutely,
it's almost Lynchian stylization.
When Bedelia turns up, it tips right over. Of course, it goes straight for this is actually the statue of a Greek goddess come to life. This woman is never ever anything less than pristine, no matter what she's doing.
Let's not jump ahead, but you know what you're doing when you bring Gillian Anderson into it. The use of the very immediately out of the bat, they know exactly how they're going to alternate between hallucinatory dream image, horrifying image, and realism, how they're going to negotiate their way in and out of the surreal imagery back into the realistic imagery and so on. how they're going to use tableau, how they're going to use very, very close-ups on certain things, usually not faces, but usually on objects that somehow reflect the story. All this stuff, it's just there from the start. There's very little sense. I mean, maybe watching it through from here, I will see more come in and I will see it building itself, but it just feels going back to it and watching these first 2 episodes like it's all there from the start.
It does, doesn't it? It's a strange
feel like
thing.
It's a tremendous amount of super intention in this. In this,
there's a real
how much there actually was, or how much these are happy coincidences, but it really feels very precise.
It really does. I mean, how much happy coincidence there is here, I just cannot discern. I can't tell.
One of the things that really struck me is that I mean, it's an incredibly beautiful looking program, of course, but it suddenly occurred to me the distance that we've come. I mean, this is television, and I know presumably it was on quite late at night when it was shown in the States. But the imagery beneath that pattern of beauty is stuff that would have been smacked with high ratings as by I mean RX ratings. I think the distance we've now come to the point where. Forgive me for jumping ahead a little bit, but it's a scene that always stays in my mind, which is even Manhunter shrinks back from some of the real gross out stuff that that is pulled.
It's quite Manhunter.
Sorry?
It's quite coy, Manhunter.
Oh yes, yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, some of the imagery, the so-called tooth theory in the Hannibal series is by orders of magnitude far more visceral and frightening than anything in Manhunter, which has the the added I guess bonus for its producers of being a film that didn't need to be that probably was happy going for an R rating, whatever it was, but this is television, and you think, man, we've traveled a long way in the last few decades, that now this kind of material can get put on.
And it just escalates, of course. When we get into the 3rd season, we'll get there when we get there. But the violence is, and the bodily mutilation is absolutely florid.
And I would love to understand how that occurred. Is that how slow or how fast that's happened, or what the codes are behind the scenes. Because even if you went back to when. Certainly when Jack and I were children, the sensitivity around what you could show, and particularly in an American television as well. And it's like, wow, where did the change happen?
Well, I mean, I was born in the 1980s, so we were in the midst of the Mary Whitehouse, the video nasty scare and whatnot. Everything was being censored. Children's television. There was
in the States a very, very strong, organized. I mean, it branched off into music with Typical and things like that. But they had equivalents, and of course, often driven by even more fundamentalist Christian motivation. But I mean, that just struck me watching these 2 episodes. This is, my God, I know it would have been put on late, but this is still television. This is still
absolutely.
What we is purported to be the entertainment for everyone. You're not buying a ticket and going into a cinema. This is in your home.
Yeah, and this is early days. This is early days. I mean, it's gonna get worse. It's gonna get a lot nastier.
Yeah.
Series 1 goes to some very extreme places. Some of the ones coming up, if I remember rightly.
Yeah. When we get to them, we'll get to them. But as a
couple of things I'd like to sort of get your thoughts on, really. One of them is the emphasis on Hannibal's work being on evolutionary origins of social exclusion. That was an interesting noise, don't you think?
Wasn't it just?
I think that's I don't know. I don't like the idea of Hannibal being a sort of evolutionary psychologist, to be honest.
Right. And the thing is, he
surely.
isn't. Right. The thing is, he isn't. He's one of these people who probably understands everything that's ever been done on evolutionary psychology and probably just wrote it as a wheeze, you know? But he is not an evolutionary psychologist.
Well, I think
we know that.
I was a bit shy about saying this because I was thinking, oh, this is me not wanting him to be Evo Psych. I'm just imagining this. But when I watched it, I thought I saw him smirk every time somebody brings it up.
Yeah.
Is he just thinking, oh, you fell for that, did you? I wrote that thing just because that's the fashionable. The Evo Psych is the fashionable thing in the academy when I was a student. So
this is exactly the point, because of course it would have been it's a few years before, but that whole thing, evolutionary psychology, and you think, well, it's another layer of camouflage for Hannibal.
Yeah,
you know, and I think there's just something, you know, we see that he has, particularly in Mads's interpretation, he has such a sense of humor, and he is such a natural satirist of everything.
He's a little bit of a rascal, this version of Hannibal, isn't he? You know, but it's interesting that Crawford is the one that brings that to him, right? It's interesting that Crawford is the one that brings this paper to him. He seems to be impressed by it. He's the one who seems to be impressed by it, and it's almost like you get the impression, like, yes, I can see, like, it's Hannibal almost like laying the bait. So this is the fish I've caught. This is the idiot who's gone for this.
Jack Crawford would go for
be amazed if Jack had actually read it.
Right.
Yeah.
He's doing that. Very interesting. I bet
he's read about memes in a Sunday supplement, and Hannibal will play with him about that. So, all right.
I've read about what you've written, but I haven't actually read what you've written.
I read the what do they call it? The bit at the front, the bit at the start that sort of sums it up.
Yeah.
Oh, the abstract.
The abstract. Yeah, I kept on wanting to say the argument, but that's what you put at the front of a poem in the in the 18th century. No. The other thing. This is something the show does all the way through, and we've already kind of mentioned it, which is this thing where it takes things from the original novels and also things from the movies, particularly the most famous of the movies, which is Silence of the Lambs, and it puts them in, and it's interesting that it can do that and expect the audience to notice and expect the audience to appreciate. It really does show you that at this point we're not just dealing with a set of stories, we're dealing with a mythology, we're dealing with a lore that we can expect people to be familiar with, you know. But it brings things in and it scrambles them. Like in this one, it's Hannibal's first meeting with Jack Crawford, and it's a direct echo of the backstory in Red Dragon of how Will catches Hannibal. Because of course, in the novel, it's just they meet for the first time, and Will immediately realizes that he's the Chesapeake Ripper, and Hannibal tries to kill him and arrest him. That's the entirety of their relationship before the trial, and then Will comes back to talk to him in Red Dragon. That's it. That's their entire. So, the thing in the novel is that Will sees the Wound Man, the illustration of the Wound Man, and he recognizes it as the pattern of wounds on one of the Chesapeake Ripper's victims, and he just makes the intuitive leap. Well, not only is that scene directly mirrored in the scene where Jack Crawford, instead of Will, meets Hannibal for the first time to ask his opinion, but also the Wound Man is there on the table, tucked underneath those illustrations that Jack Crawford looks through.
That's right, yes, because it comes back later, of course, in the Miriam Last story.
Yes, because she's a direct echo of Clarice Starling.
She is, but she's also the Will Graham from the books.
Yeah.
She's the Will Graham from the books, whereas this Will Graham is a completely other order of entity.
Different Will. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's an impressive piece of work. I mean, I do remember first seeing it, because I came to the show and I was almost reluctant. I just didn't, as I said in the previous episode, I just didn't think it could work. I thought it was going to
be this good.
I cannot. I lack the language. Yeah, I lack the language to describe my incredulity. No matter how many times I watch it, I almost sit there saying to myself, this does not exist.
Yeah.
This kind of alchemy, this kind of magic doesn't work in our world. It doesn't. Things don't coalesce this beautifully. It's almost impossible. It's an impossible work for me in terms of just
completely cynical. It was just the amount of people who with whom I trust, who kept saying, no, watch it, because it sounded impossibly naff.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of a prequel, and I mean, I was impressed that Mads Mikkelsen was in it because that he's really good and everything. Yeah. But even so, it wasn't enough to make me think this could. And I expected it also to look incredibly cheap, and thin, and but as I say, enough people will go on. You'll be surprised, and I'm very glad, and I was. Yeah, and it's certainly interesting to do. This, as I say, this is only my second viewing.
Umpteen million.
There's, but it's been great to come back to.
Yeah.
Really,
it always is. I mean, as I say, I have to temper myself because I would watch it again and again and again and again and just enjoy it every single time, and would then not experience new things ever. I would just be happy with this show, I'm
at a very difficult point in my life where I realized that I reread and rewatch a lot. And I have to remember that, there's still such a thing as having a present and a bit of a future.
But there are new things, and some of them aren't bad.
But it's less of a distrust of things can't possibly be decent, but it's more. I'm kind of enjoying at the moment being of an age where I can go back to things and the perspective on them is so hugely different. And it really striking. I said 2 weeks ago, I randomly had an urge to, I think I said to Jack, a bizarre urge to reread Wuthering Heights, which I had not read since I was in my late teens. Well, it was like reading a completely different book from the perspective of a 40-something. Well, it's like reading this afresh, and it did it just. I've been seems to be I've gone through a spate of just rereading stuff I've already read, but years have passed, or rewatching stuff that I haven't seen. Jaws is
Jaws, obviously,
that was about 20 years.
Different eyes, different preconceptions, right?
And, but the excitement of coming back to these things, and particularly if they still yield up something. But I could definitely see. I mean, this has been really good to come back to, and I could definitely now anticipate further rewatches.
I mean, as I said, I rewatched
I've got to keep my antenna up because I think it's one of the things that inevitably happens. You've got to really force yourself to keep going. Come on, just have a feel for other things that are out there. It comes so naturally when you're young, because you are cultivating, you are curating your own stuff around you,
and also you're ravenous, aren't you? I mean, you are insatiable for media and material at that point.
You're also now very protective of the things that you love. I mean, I've got there are those films, those books, those albums, which I'm now. I hug them to me, and of course anything new has got to penetrate that, because you've had it for so long, and you had it from a formative age, and it's just because that awareness of, like, it's okay to let new things in.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
But I do have to consciously tell myself that sometimes. It's because I can
the older I get. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just saying, because I look at the, what is available, and I feel like, sometimes it's, I don't have a map and compass for this. Whereas you sort of just do it when you're in your teens or your 20s or whatever. And now it almost comes with a trepidation about starting things, because I don't know what it is. So will I? will I waste time? I don't have enough time left to waste.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was just going to say that. As I get older, I get worried about, well, what if I commit to this and I spend hours? It's a waste of time. I could have been reading one of the other books.
No.
Yeah. I could have been reading Dorian Gray again.
I think part of the problem is when you find something that's of such quality and that you connect with so absolutely, which speaks to you in a language that you really understand. You get to that point where you're like, well, I could watch this similar show or this new show, but it won't be as good. It won't speak to me in the same way. It won't have the same level of connection or frisson. And that's a problem I come up against quite a lot, especially with regards to Hannibal. It's like, okay, Hannibal is Hannibal. I need to put it aside, and I need to start, getting Aurelian on this. Appreciate things in and of themselves, what they are, not in comparison to these other things.
This is the terrible allure of trash, isn't it? Because it's so easy to say, well, I'll read this book or I'll watch this series because I don't care about it. I'll play it safe. I'll watch this thing that, it's just crap. I don't care about it, but it'll be fun. I know it'll be fun. So that's a safe bet. That's where crap has its deadly allure, because it says, well, you know you're going to enjoy this, so you don't have to worry about whether or not it's good. Just put it on and enjoy.
Exactly.
And that's fine, but you can't do that all the time.
No, you're absolutely right. And even with the good stuff, you can't keep really rewatching the good stuff over and over and over and over again. You need to branch out. You need to actually feed your mind and your imagination something a little bit different.
Yeah.
But Hannibal makes it hard. God damn it!
One thing I did want to talk about is the scene between Hannibal and Freddie Lowndes. We kind of already talked about that a little bit, but I love that sequence so much, because I love how this character, Freddie Lowndes, who's gone through the entire episode to this point, just effortlessly and fearlessly manipulating everybody she meets. Like, Hannibal just effortlessly takes the upper hand and dominates her. And he turns her basically by the end of the scene. She sat next to him on the sofa, that very weird flex where he sits on the sofa, or the chaise, I should probably say. And he says, come and sit down, and he taps it. And it's turned into a naughty schoolgirl in the headmaster's office.
Absolutely. He becomes paternalistic, doesn't he?
I literally expected him to say, I don't bite. And I thought, no, maybe that would have been just a step too far.
If it's not a cut line, I will be surprised.
I imagine that must have fallen on the drafts, and they probably agonized over that. Do we have that line or not?
It's the timing of it as well, because the tendency would be to let her go on a little bit further with the charade, but he doesn't. He just says, "Are you Freddie Lowndes?"
But he gets the upper hand on it. But also, and it might just be purely the way that Mads plays it, he's intrigued by her. I mean, she runs against everything that he properly sees as correct, but she's interesting to him. Just for a moment, there's a flash of what you do is abhorrent, and yet you do it with a real inbuilt to do it.
I think she is the kind of and I think for Hannibal, she's the kind of character who elevates rudeness to art.
Yeah, she believes in it. She's a believer.
Yeah.
And that appeals to him. I think if he was faced with someone who was a cynic, just a hack, but she believes in that. That's why she's so good at it. The sequence when she inveigles her way into the site, the crime, where she manipulates that cop as she is in turn manipulated by Hannibal.
She is a great character. She's the character you love to hate, isn't she? She is irredeemable. She's absolutely irredeemable, that character. And I think the reframing of the character as a woman, because in the book Freddie Lowndes is a man, obviously. I don't know. It works. Something about that dynamic makes it even better.
One of the things it does is it creates this constant feeling of dread, because if you know the stories, you know what happens to Freddie Lowndes.
Of course.
And as it goes on, you realize that the show is, as I say, it's taking stuff from the original novels and it's changing them and mixing them up and recontextualizing them. So it's not necessarily going to be exactly the same. And of course, as it turns out, it's not. It's not what happens. But it does create this very uncomfortable tension where you think, God, is that where this character is headed?
Yeah,
Maybe it's the old ingrained sexism, but that's worse somehow.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. No, I get it. But also, I mean, just from, I guess, on purely practical terms, it sounds awful and cynical, but because she's brilliant, I mean, and she's so well played, but
yeah,
we're already been set into a format where the triumvirate is Hannibal, Will, and Jack, and Alana's a peripheral presence at the moment, and so Freddie does help with that gender flip.
Of course.
Just to so it doesn't become sort of relentlessly male.
No, it's true.
But she's brilliant. I mean, she's such a find. The actress is such a find.
She's great.
She gets it. And
again,
she's one of those things that could so easily have been parodied and or just played a little bit too much. But she finds it. She finds the truth in a character like that. I mean, she's just repellent and yet stylish and a believer.
And also, one of these, she, like all the other characters, certainly all the main players, she's elevated. The way she talks about what she does and the way she talks about her own motivations and morality. Nobody in reality talks about things like that, certainly about themselves. I love that.
But that theatricality runs right throughout it, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
It's there in the production design, it's in the characterization, it's in the writing, it's I mean, in its way, as you were saying earlier about those few things that have, I've allowed to get into my life. It does it in a different way, but I think in terms of its writing, the way the characters speak about themselves and each other, it's almost like a cousin under the skin of Deadwood. Again, another very, very explicitly theatrical program. I mean, obviously its dialogue runs in a different way, but they share a kind of singular vocabulary. I'd say no one speaks like the people in Hannibal speak. Nobody speaks like the people in Deadwood speak. They have it's this internal consistency and with this theatrical quality to it.
I find that very difficult to resist. I must admit, when a show or a piece of media does that, and it knows it's doing it, and it just runs with it. It makes no apology.
Well, Hannibal and Deadwood are two shows that I watched with subtitles on. Not because I couldn't hear the dialogue or I felt the mix was bad, but because the dialogue is so
wait till Bedelia turns up. Oh my God, some of the lines they feed her. In fact, the actress, what's her name? Gillian Anderson. That's right. Have you seen the interviews with her about the lines that they fed her? She says, "I had no idea what it meant. I had no idea, but I tried to give it the weight that it deserved."
Yeah. The only other program, to a slightly lesser extent, but again, it would probably be Boardwalk Empire. All three have their own unique vocabulary, and all three programs I watched with the subtitles on.
You're gonna need to when we get to season 3, definitely.
Oh, I adore season 3. I mean, I'd say I've seen them all through once, but season 3 was
it's my favorite too.
Because they're unleashed by that point. I mean,
Dante and Blake. I mean, come on.
What can you do? Axis? Well, no, because that's literally all that's left. It's that wonderful position for a program that once it's bedded itself in and played the game a little bit. And then it can go, right, well, we might not get a 4th season if we do this, but hell, let's go.
Let's just go for it. Let's do them all together. Let's do it all in one. Brilliant.
Well, that was splendid.
Guys, that was wonderful. Before we go, again, as per usual, is there anything you'd like to pimp out?
Go to my Twitter if you like, and that's @_Jack_Graham_. Links to pretty much everything I do are on there. I sometimes write things that they're at Eruditorium Press or at my Substack Times Carcass. I have Patreon. If you give me $1 a month, you get advanced access to anything that I write or any podcasts that I do, like this one, for instance. You'll probably get this a bit before it ends up on YouTube. I sometimes do podcasts including the main one I do, which is called I Don't Speak German, which I do with Daniel Harper, which is a podcast in which he explains various horrible people on the far right to me. And that's it. So, yeah.
Brilliant.
Follow that. Well, well, I'm a work-shy fop, so I do almost
you work-shy fop.
I'm absolutely work-shy fop. But if anyone needs to go on a train journey and doesn't want to sleep and they don't want to read, they can always access any of the audiobooks that I've done, either as a narrator or as a producer. Better to get the ones where I produce, because then you get someone else's voice, and it's a much more pleasant experience for everyone.
Oh.
But I will still hopefully get a ex gratia payment if you. But they're all available from places that they're available from.
He's done all the Wilbur Smith novels, folks. It's all him.
Yeah, thanks for that. So that was quite a trek. I was doing the African cycle. There was another actor doing the Egyptian cycle, and I can't remember where the other one said. But we all used to just get together and cry on each other's shoulders. And we were like, when is it going to end?
I don't know what you're talking about. Wilbur Smith's a genius.
Yeah, he's such a genius that now he's dead, but still releases brand new books because he is a brand. So other writers piggyback on his name.
Oh wow!
I mean,
that's right. You have to be really good. You have to be.
Yeah. I mean, that's
you have to be Virginia Andrews level in order to keep doing that.
Oh my god!
You have to be the Earl of Oxford. Keep on writing after you're dead.
Oh my god! There's a name from my past when I was a librarian, way before I did anything. My first job as a librarian, Virginia Andrews books. Bloody hell! Wow. There's so many of them. So many.
It's very. I mean, from the being on the producing side, and you obviously you really then have to deal with publishers and publishing houses and everything, and finding what sells and to which demographic is really fascinating. I mean, Hannibal levels of macabre crime. Women, but tend to be white middle class women, sort of between 40 and 65, absolutely lap that up. That's the biggest demographic for audiobooks. That, I mean, they're really graphic as well. Really graphic crime fiction. And
sounds great.
They all live in the home counties of the Cotswolds or somewhere, and they just laugh it up. It actually beats for that demographic romance novels.
I love it.
We always used to be told, "Oh well, you know, it'll be the romance novels or the Catherine Cooksons that really beats that demographic." No, it's the most visceral crime fiction. You know, the most horrible crimes. That's what they go for.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
You know, there's not much to do else. You know, in your nice little village in the middle of the Cotswolds. So it's your little glimpse into the abyss, I guess.
Oh man, I love it. The existential abyss just invading the sunlit uplands. Yeah.
It's really fun to get as well, because when we're recording them and knowing that demographic is there, and I usually work with a lot of women for these, because they get a lot of women voices. I think largely because a lot of new crime fiction has kind of inherited that Linda LaPlante prime suspect thing by having a prominent woman detective, but also it you know, victims are still classically, and we sort of plot it in at the point where you can really make the listener jump with screams and just saying to these actors, do more. Are you sure? Yeah, just go, really go for it.
Yeah, go wild.
And it's fantastic. So, we've just made 50 of them jump.
As for myself, ladies and gents, as per usual, you can find me here on Exaggerated Elegy. whether there are various podcasts, video game let's plays, and just videos, general discussions about this and that. Links to all of my published work, my short story collections, can be found over at strangeplaygrounds.com. And when it's back up, the new Ginger Nuts of Horror website will be hosting a lot of my non-fiction, the My Life in Horror series, which I've inherited from our good friend Kit Power. And if you'd like to chat to me, you can come and chat to me over on Twitter at Enigmatic Elegy. Guys, thank you so much. I'm so glad we've got this off the ground now.
Yay!
Yeah.
And 2 more episodes.
This went really
next
well.
time.
I think this is going to be
Wait,
2 more episodes next time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when this gets going, it's going to be really, really good. When we really start to get into it and things start to gamble, this is going to be fun.
I think this was kind of an experiment, but I think it worked really well. 2 episodes at a time, and
very respectful indeed.
Lovely. Okay, I gotta go. But this was
Take care,
fantastic.
both.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys.
Everybody.
Speak to you soon.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye.